And we are lucky today to have Dr. Gaurab Basu speaking to us on climate change and health equity. Dr. Basu is an instructor at Harvard Medical School, a primary care physician at Cambridge Health Alliance, and co-director of the CHA Center for Health Equity, Education, and Advocacy. He is also the course director of the social medicine curriculum at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Basu has a background in human rights, global health, and health equity education, and is passionate about climate change and justice. He is currently part of the Robert Wood Johnson Culture of Health Leaders Fellowship, and also received the Charles McCabe Faculty Prize in Excellence in Teaching Award at Harvard Medical School for Clinical Education. Basu is trained in community organizing. He served as a coach for workshops run by Harvard Kennedy School Professor Marshall Gans. He has previously worked for many institutions around climate change, health equity, and our role as agents of social change across the country. And I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Basu through the New England Journal 360 Resident 360 series on climate change and health, where we first got to discuss health equity and climate change. And I am looking forward to your lecture today. Thanks so much, Dr. Basu.
Thanks, Becca. And thank you so much for having me. Becca and I connected because I'm a huge fan of her work, and I reached out to her saying, I really appreciate all she's doing. So it's wonderful to connect with the Emory community. And I was mentioning my wife is from Atlanta, and we got married there. So I'm a regular visitor of Atlanta, and really grateful to be with you today. So my name is Gaurab. Becca introduced me. But I'm really grateful to talk to you. I know you've had a really rich curriculum so far and a number of really great speakers. And I will really present today the lens in which I think about climate change through an health equity lens, a social medicine lens. And I've updated my slides a bit in the last few weeks to reflect some of my thinking about the pandemic and the interconnectedness of the various threats that we face today. A very hard time, but a real time, I think, for imagination of how we move forward. So I don't have any disclosures. And just for a roadmap again, so I think it's important for us to be thinking about this issue of climate change in this new era. Of course, the pandemic has upended so much, and I think it'll be important for us to be thinking about policies and ways to build into the future with lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. And then I'm really, again, going to just focus on the way I think about climate change's impact on health and health equity issues. And then we'll end on talking about the advocacy roles we can play. I think a thing I'd like you to consider throughout the talk today, and hopefully through the course, is what role do I play in this? As an educator, I love seeing the various passions and interests that students bring to their work, and I'm sure you're a very diverse group of people with very different interests. But I'd argue to you that the work of environmental justice and climate mitigation and planetary health is going to touch every piece of our work into the future. And whether you want to be a full-time clinician, a policymaker, a researcher, an advocate, to explore your role in this work, because we certainly need everyone's hands on deck. And then sources of courage. I am by disposition a pretty optimistic, positive person. And I'll tell you a little bit my story about getting into this work. But I promised myself to be honest and to share hard truths and to learn the hard truths myself. And so I don't want to sugarcoat what is a hard situation, a dire situation, but also to tell you that, in fact, I have a lot of sources of courage and hope, and want to tell you a little bit about that. So whenever I start a talk, I like to take just a minute, and I think that's particularly relevant to this time in the world we are right now, to name the fact that I think climate change is a complex issue. It can be overwhelming, it's emotional, but it can paralyze us, it can deflate us, it can make us feel like overwhelmed and that we can't move forward. That's real for many of us to have that reaction. And you're welcome to, in the chat, if you're interested, to kind of chime in with some of the kind of emotional reactions, psychological reactions that you might have when you start thinking about climate change. But what we do need is urgent action and transformative action. And so we're caught in this dilemma of how we can look this issue in the eye, and find within ourselves part of the solutions and to find the courage to move forward. I'll just very briefly tell you about my own experience. So, my background is in human rights and global health work, health equity work. And I was rooting along climate change, thinking it was a pretty important issue, but frankly did not realize the true implications of it until really the IPCC report in 2018. And I'll touch upon that. You might have touched upon it in the course already. But that really woke me up. And as I've gotten into this community more, people call it kind of their climate awakening, their moment of awakening. And that really happened for me. And all these things that I cared about as a physician and as a parent, my awakening kind of happened as my wife was pregnant. And that's probably not a coincidence. It just made me realize that climate change touches upon and threatens all the things I care about. And so if we want a sustainable future, a future in which we can eat and food and not be food insecure, have access to clean water, to mitigate the threats of political conflict, things like that, the climate change of all of that. And I've been trying to work to really incorporate climate change work into the human rights community as well. So let me just start here with the intersections of climate change and COVID. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm thinking about it right now. And, my thoughts are evolving. As a primary care doctor, I'm doing a lot of clinical work with COVID positive patients and managing them while they're at home and determining whether they need to have a higher level of care in our respiratory clinic or emergency room. So there's a lot of suffering and there's a very hard time. But I think also we need to step back, especially as we move forward and hopefully get out of this kind of emergency state, to be thinking broadly and big, in big terms about this, and really be asking ourselves, what are the root issues of this and how do we do our best to prevent something like this from happening in the future? And so here are 3 takeaways. I'll introduce them to you today, and I basically sprinkle them throughout the talk, and I'll come back to these 3 points at various points of the talk. But one of my takeaways is that the health of our planet is inextricably linked to human health and health equity, that for us to take care of each other, for us to heal each other, for people to be healthy, our planet has to be healthy. Number 2 is that climate change and COVID-19 are not one issue. They're not individual issues. In my mind, they are everything issues. They touch upon a profound number of issues that many people care about. And then number 3, I think we need to be thinking about the implications of what happens when the effects of this pandemic compound the already existing threats of climate change. And so we'll talk a little about a couple examples. And these point to the fact that for both climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, it really challenges us to dig deep and fundamentally rethink the way we want to proceed into the future and promote healthy communities. All right, so number 1, I'll start out by touching upon how I'm thinking about this first piece. So I will admit that I'm guilty sometimes of anchoring too much in the notion of climate change, and that, when I'm doing my advocacy work and when I'm teaching, I speak about climate change, and really what we should be talking even more about is planetary health. So of course, climate change, we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, the way it's warming our atmosphere, but planetary health asks us to do even more than that. And so, in medical school, as you're preparing to become good doctors for your patients, the notion that a guest lecturer would come into you and say, hey, we should really be thinking about ecosystems might be like, wait a minute, what are you saying? What does that have to do with my work? Then I'd come into to your class today and tell you biodiversity is something that we really need to be thinking about and has profound implications for the future of human health. Might be not something traditionally we think about as the purview of doctors in medical school. But the thing is, our ecosystems are in peril. And there was a major UN report that came out in May 2019, just about a year ago, that I think was a kind of milestone report. And I hope that you guys all will keep this report and its findings in the back of your mind as you proceed forward in your training. So staggeringly, what the report told us is that 1 million species are at the risk of being extinct. They identified that there were kind of 5 major issues that they really spotlighted. And that was changes in the uses of land and sea, the direct exploitation of organism, things like wildlife trading, climate change, of course, pollution, and then the invasion of alien species, they called it, when we are decimating ecosystems and biodiversity, other species can replace that. So the chair of this committee, this UN committee, said it, I think, very artfully, that the health of our ecosystems on which we and other species depend upon is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, our livelihoods, our food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. So these issues that Robert Watson identifies in this quote are things that we care about: food security, health, quality of life. And he's articulating the underpinning of our ecological health in those things we care about as physicians. And so this is a graph just showing you how exponentially the increase of extinctions over time has grown exponentially in modern history. Becca actually sent me this picture, which I thought was powerful. I honestly, I will be honest, as a human rights doctor, I never really thought I'd be thinking about bugs and insects and biodiversity. I want to take care of people. I want people to have their rights respected. I want to really anchor in notions of dignity and making sure we take care of people properly and make sure people are treated with respect in society. And so it's really taken me a bit of time to wrap my head around the fact that our relationship with our other species and our planetary home is foundational to all those things I care about. So what does this mean? What is the relevance to this in COVID-19? So COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. What that means is that it is passed from animals to people. And in fact, 70% of emerging diseases start with an animal host. And so this was a piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, and I thought captured the issue of COVID and the transmission from animals to humans well. The problem is not the animals, according to scientists who study zoonotic diseases that pass between animals and humans, it's us. Wild animals have always had viruses coursing through their bodies, but a global wildlife trade worth billions of dollars, agricultural intensification, deforestation, urbanization, are bringing people closer to animals and giving their viruses more of what they need to infect us: opportunity. Most fail, and some succeed on small scales. Very few, like the coronavirus, triumph aided by a supremely interconnected human population that can transport a pathogen around the world on a jet in mere hours. So this is how I'm thinking about it, all right? So we absolutely, I think about climate change a lot. It's probably the first place I go to in my work of thinking about environmental health and human health. But we need to dig in even further and understand that deforestation, air pollution, habitat encroachment and destruction, we're moving into places that nature did not want us to be, the misuse of our land and water, such that we are growing out agriculture far more than we should be. We're interfacing with wildlife in ways that have profound implications for our health. All of these lead to not only atmospheric warming, but ecological instability, the loss of biodiversity, and species migration. So animals are interacting with other animals that are out of their equilibrium. And as we are moving in these places that were not our historical interfaces, the risks of transmission of diseases that were buffered, that ecology had created buffers for us, that buffer is getting decimated. So healthy ecosystems keep diseases in check, and our ecosystems breaking down, which it profoundly is right now, enable diseases to spill over into the human population with increased frequency. So I'm really worried about this, and I think it's a story that needs to be really articulated clearly as we go through this pandemic, and particularly when we can get out of this surge phase and really be digging into how we allow this to not happen again. All right, so I'm going to come back to the frame of climate and health equity. And so this IPCC report was my light bulb moment. It was that moment where I finally realized the importance of climate change on health and health equity. And so to review those bottom line findings there is that we've already warmed 1 degree from pre-industrial levels, that warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is likely to happen as soon as 2030, but sometime between 2030 and 2052 at the current rate. and that in order to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we must decrease our greenhouse emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So let me say that another way. We need to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. In order to do that, we need to get about half of the way there by 2030. The UN Environmental Program has said it another way, that we need to, at an annual rate, be decreasing our emissions by 7.6%. Last year, we flatlined. We were basically around zero, but we have been increasing over time. The fact that we are slowly plateauing in emissions is not a success because we need to be dramatically decreasing our emissions. 7.6 is a large number, in fact. So this is a very busy slide. I don't want you to process all of it. This is my slide to say that I'm not a climate scientist. There's a lot of climate science that is very complex and that I will never be trained to do. But I follow climate scientists, and I've come to kind of understand the IPCC. Jonathan Patz is one of them, who I think is involved in this course. But I follow the climate scientists and listen to them and understand what they're telling us about the trajectories of the future. And my best read, though this is not a concrete thing, but generally what I am hearing from the climate scientists I respect a lot is that we're headed towards something between 2 to 3 degrees of warming. Now, of course, the Paris Accord has asked us to keep warming to 1.5, and I am absolutely positive we have what we need to do that. It'll take, and I believe that is absolutely still a possibility, but the window is certainly closing to mitigate to 1.5 degrees Celsius. A point I want to make is all of these outcomes are bad. We are already, of course, seeing the impacts and the ravages of climate change today. And it's not a success to limit climate change to global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That'll have profound implications. But a lot of times, and frankly, I even, 5, 6, 7 years ago used to think, what is 2 degrees Celsius of warming? That doesn't seem like it's so bad. And I think therein lies some of the problem, that these numbers remain relatively abstract to people who are looking to take care of people like doctors. And so this is a piece out of Nature, and I'll draw your attention to the bar graph at the bottom. And so these are variables I care a heck of a lot about: heat wave exposure, water stress, risk to power production, crop yield change, so how many times crops fail because of heat and don't grow, and then habitat degradation. So take a look at those numbers and know that they're in the millions. So for that heat wave number, that's 3.9 billion people. Okay, so this is a graph showing, these bars are showing what happens at 1.5 degrees of warming. And I'm going to scroll through and tell you what happens at 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of warming. So take a look at those numbers there. This is at 2. This is at 3. So it's an overwhelming number. And again, this is a place where I'm promising myself not to look, not to sugarcoat this, because these are dramatic numbers. And so my takeaway message to you all is that there's a profound difference of mitigating to 1.5 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius. We've got to do everything in our power to work as fast and as in depth as we can to solve these problems. All right, so I'm not sure if you saw this slide already, but you've been introduced to the many pathways in which climate interfaces with our human health. And so it really touches upon so many different things, right? I'm not gonna go into this in great detail because I know you're covering these pathways throughout the course. But I'll just name that the New England Journal, I think, has been doing a great job presenting information and articulating the threat of climate change to human health. They have a number of resources, but I like this graph to show some of these pathways. So what I'm going to do instead is just tell you about a patient of mine. So this is my hospital, so I did my training there, and I'm a primary care doctor there. And I had a 30-year-old patient who came in with asthma. He had moved to the United States about 5 years previously from Central America. Back home, he was a farmer, sugarcane farmer, so worked out outside. He was a parent of a young child, usually had not established care in the United States, usually didn't really kind of see doctors much, but, his wife was telling him, you should really go in, we've got a young kid, we got to make sure you stay healthy, and had symptoms of shortness of breath, orthopnea, headache, and fatigue. So it seems nondescript. Again, this was a couple years ago. came in just check up, thought he might have some kind of viral or bacterial kind of thing going on and wanted some medicine and get better. And sadly, and very tragically, he was found to have end-stage renal disease, which was jarring and stunning. I met the patient soon after a hospitalization. He was devastated, as could be understood. And wonder on chat if anyone could chime in and say what they think I might be getting at here. Why am I presenting you this clinical case? Any ideas? Is there any phenomenon you've been? There you go. It's Claire, CKDU. Great. So this this piece in the New England Journal touches upon CKDU. So chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. It's sometimes known as Mesoamerican kidney disease. So this is a phenomenon in which people who are exposed to prolonged and severe heat, day in and day out, have acute kidney injuries that are happening repeatedly because of dehydration mechanisms, so pre-renal mechanism. And people don't know it, right? You don't know that slowly your kidneys are not getting perfused properly enough until you're profoundly sick. And of course, my mind goes a lot to our farming community in Central America. Particularly, there's a high level of mortality and morbidity from this condition. And I think the authors of this piece articulately describe this as a new era of climate medicine. So this really was what really brought home the role of heat that plays into people's health. So this is some information from my context up here in Massachusetts. I live in Cambridge, and so I'm a global health doctor, so I think a lot about the implications on people around the world, but am clear-minded that these impacts are happening very locally as well. So in the Northeast here, in fact, the Northeast is the quadrant of the United States that's warming faster than any other part of the United States. And while most of the US has an average of about 1 degree Celsius of warming from pre-industrial levels, we've nearly doubled that in my county at 1.7 degrees Celsius. And this is a graph that was supplied by the city of Cambridge, Department of Public Health. And so let me walk through this graph for you. So if you look at the orange, kind of our baseline, historically, we've had about 10 days above 90 degrees and 1 day above 100 degrees. And they're estimating, based on their projections, that into the future, let's call this a baseline of, or call this the 2030 range, that will increase to 29 days of heat over 90 degrees of dangerous heat and 2 days over 100. And then you look into the future, what they're projecting to around 2070 is much more than that. So you can see how many days that increases. Those new colors in there, the yellow there, you can see the added days, and then the pink for additional days of 90 degrees and 100 is in the kind of the worst climate projections. So this is showing the range of possibilities. So heat, of course, has profound implications on our health. I think a lot about heart attacks and COPD and asthma exacerbations, premature labor, mental health disease, depression, anxiety, violence. So it basically impacts all the things I think about as a primary care doctor. And it made me wonder, am I thinking enough about the implications of heat? And certainly in Atlanta, you all need to be thinking about this as well. Am I asking myself, I take pride in knowing my patients and knowing their exposures. Am I thinking enough about what exposures? Do I know, concretely what my folks who are working in construction, what their heat exposures are? Do I know who has an AC at their home, whether they're going to be safe during a heat wave? In the heat wave, 1995 heat wave, Chicago heat wave, one of the things they found in studies afterwards is one of the variables that enabled protection from mortality from that heat wave, one of the most important things was social connections. So what are people going to do during a heat wave? Do they have people who can look after them, check in? Does my community have a cooling center? Should we have a registry, just the way I do for diabetes and blood pressure outreach? People I should be more worried about during heat waves, should I be checking in with them and understanding their plan? So as a primary care doctor, I also want to just make sure I introduce this notion of health co-benefits. So what that means is that there are independent mechanisms in which investing in our planet and making sure we mitigate climate change, that has a mechanism in helping our planet, and separately, it has a mechanism in which it helps human health directly. So it's a win all across the board. So as a primary care doctor, of course, one of the most important things I try to educate on is healthy eating. So of course, decreasing red meat and eating a more vegetable-based diet is important for human health if it's done right. And decreasing our agricultural footprint is a very important piece of our planet's health. Of course, I want people to exercise. So I want people to be walking around, to get out of their cars, to be moving around and to be moving. But in order to do this, there's a study in JAMA that showed that neighborhood walkability was associated with a change in being overweight, obese, or having diabetes. But we're going to need policy to be able to put the infrastructure in place to make our towns and cities walkable. We need public transit. We need the ability to bike and walk around. And if we don't have a built environment for that, you all probably talked about that yesterday, we're not only increasing emissions, but we're also directly impacting people's health on these parameters. And then, of course, air pollution, dirty energy systems and transportation systems that emit all these pollutants, emit greenhouse gas emissions that warm our planet, and also have a number of pollutants that directly impact our cardiovascular health and our pulmonary health. So this is a graph here showing, I really like the Yale program on climate change communication. I think they've done great work in articulating, identifying the ways in which people are thinking about climate change. I'm going to pull your attention to the second from the bottom bar. So you can see the various ways in which people think about this: environmental issue, scientific issue. Overwhelmingly, people think of global warming as an environmental issue or a scientific issue. But not that many think of it as a social justice or fairness issue, only 24%. And I'd like to make the argument that we need to do that we need to be framing climate change as an issue of fairness and even, ethics and morality, of particularly as a parent now, as I think about the future of our children, that there is a fairness issue, that we can't just leave a tattered planet in which there's more health implications and natural disasters into the future. So Jonathan Patz had this piece in one of his studies. It's just a schema. I'll touch upon it very briefly. But at the top here, you can see a diagram showing the proportionality of emissions over time, of carbon dioxide emissions by country. So you can see the United States is, of course, dominant there. And then at the bottom there, you can see that the global south has disproportionately reaped the implications of those emissions. So it kind of visually shows you the magnitude and severity of climate change related malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and drowning by country. So these are the things I think about first when I think about the connections of climate change and health equity. So I think about threats to our food, number one. So climate change impacts our crop yields. So as the earth gets warmer, there's gonna be a lot of places, farmlands that have been in families for generations, and suddenly the earth is not going to grow those crops in the same yield. And then secondly, the increase in carbon dioxide levels itself, not even the warming, but the carbon dioxide levels, can change the nutritional value of food itself, minerals, vitamins, things like that. So this is already in a world in which we have 820 million people malnourished. So we already have a baseline amount, we have a food crisis already, and climate change will exacerbate that. I think a lot also about forced migration, political conflict. If you've had a home and your livelihood is growing crops, you're no longer able to live there, you're going to have to move. And that's going to cause profound disruptions that have implications for our social order and our political order. I think about the threats to our water supplies. So climate change will certainly cause more drought and decreased access to clean and usable water. This is already in a world in which 1/4 of the world faces high water stress, which means that a community uses 80% of the drinkable water, it nearly runs out of water. And then 4 billion people who face water scarcity, which means they run out of water 1 month of the year. I also think about natural disasters. So Hurricane Dorian devastated the Bahamas last fall. This is a quote by a professor who grew up in the Bahamas and now is a professor in Florida. Bahamas have a tiny carbon footprint, but carry the burden of being ground zero for a climate crisis. We Bahamans listen to climate deniers in rich countries who are oblivious or indifferent to those who bear the weight of their wonderful lives. Meanwhile, the water rises from the ground in our yards because the water table is so high during high tide, and the plants we once depended upon no longer grow. We experience too much rain or too little rain. The fresh water supplies are increasingly contaminated by rising sea levels. My reaction to this, I think about the children in these coastal countries, these poor countries, these countries that are so vulnerable to this devastation. And my reaction is it just feels undignified. It feels like we can't do that to each other. That's unacceptable, that we would not feel connected to people who are so exposed to these threats. My reaction is that should feel unacceptable to us. And it should motivate us to have very aggressive action to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in our world. Of course, it's not just in the Bahamas, but Cyclone Idai that devastated Malawi, Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico have caused unbearable suffering, and not just through its death toll, but in disruptions to access to healthcare and to medicines. Here in Boston, when this happened, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there was a major IV fluids factory there, and we have ED docs here who still tell many stories in which we had no access to IV fluids for some time, and people were giving Gatorade as a way of hydration in the emergency room. So the implications are broad. More locally here, this is a graph by the Union of Concerned Scientists from just about a year ago here, and is a graph showing the disproportionate exposure to particulate matter 2.5 air pollution. So you can see in which different communities of colors throughout the state have disproportionate exposure to air pollution. And then I'm just going to touch upon it because I know you talked about this yesterday, but heat islands. So this notion that the infrastructure is cement and concrete and is not parks and tree canopies. So this is a report of Chelsea, which is in the news again right now because it's the epicenter of COVID outbreak in Massachusetts. So it could be 90 degrees over where I live in Cambridge, and 105 degrees, 110 degrees on the same day in Chelsea, just a few towns over. And Chelsea is a impoverished community in a largely Latinx community. You touched upon this study. Oh, Jeremy, there it is. So Jeremy, I'm a big, this was a really important study that Jeremy was able to shepherd. And we've talked, the difference between 2 degrees Celsius is profound. The fact that redlined communities are 2.6 degrees Celsius warmer than communities that were not redlined, that have a history of structural injustice and racism, that enabled a lack of investment into certain communities of color, is something that should shake us, and again, I think make us feel like this is unacceptable. So Dr. Jones, who's over at Morehouse in Atlanta, is a huge role model of mine. She defines structural racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks, such that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. It unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and it saps the strength of the whole society through a waste of human resources. And so I think we need to apply this lens and look at the climate crisis and ask ourselves, certainly it is unfairly disadvantaging some communities, unfairly advantaging other communities that reap kind of a luxurious use of resources, and it saps the strength of our whole global community. I also want to name, as we were talking about communities of color, that while the impacts on community of color is disproportionate and the burden is disproportionate, also we need to be turning to communities of colors for answers and resilience. And our indigenous communities are certainly at the forefront for that. So it is certainly true that our indigenous communities have had a culture of stewardship that I think we need to learn a lot of really important lessons from. So indigenous communities occupy 25% of the land on Earth, and yet that land makes up 80% of the biodiversity that we have in the world. That's remarkable, right? You could argue that these communities and the space that they are occupying on their land is holding together the biodiversity that we so desperately need for our health. All right, I'm going to come back to COVID. So here again is that slide telling you my kind of 3 takeaway points. So let's talk a little bit again about the intersection of climate change and COVID. So I'm going to argue again, as we've thought about climate change, we thought about COVID a bit. I want to make the argument today again that these are not just individual issues, they are everything issues and fundamentally issues of equity. And so climate change, I've touched upon this, I think is a healthcare issue, it's a health issue, it's a structural racism issue. We've talked about forced migration, political conflict, and food security, clean water and air, and need to be thinking about how we can create sustainable global development that does not push past the bounds of our planetary resources, our natural resources. COVID likewise has implications on healthcare and structural racism. Poverty, I think there's going to be a lot of studies trying to understand this hypothesis that individuals who are economically insecure have felt trapped and have had to go to work in situations with wealthier individuals have not, and have exposed themselves at a higher rate. And so again, Chelsea up here in Massachusetts is in the news a lot. And a hypothesis is that a lot of individuals in Chelsea have had to go to work to be able to survive financially. Housing is also very much in the news in Chelsea up here because Chelsea, there's a humongous housing crisis up here in Massachusetts. And there is an issue of kind of overcrowding and high density such that there's a number of people in many households. And we're trying to investigate the role that's played in transmissions within a household and inability to self-isolate. We are seeing reports of increased levels of domestic violence. And so how is this a gender rights issue? And then it also asks us to really be thinking about mass incarceration. The fact that we have more than 20% of the world's incarcerated people, but less than 5% of the world's total population, and a number of people who are older than 65 incarcerated makes us think about our criminal justice system. All right, so last point here on intersections is that I think we need to be thinking about the implications of the pandemic compounding the impacts of the climate change. So I've hopefully made the argument today that climate change is underneath all of these structural issues, and it's turbocharging it. It's causing cracks in the fault lines of the foundations of our society and world. And so climate change has already created a strain that threatens many of the foundational systems that holds our world together. And then this incoming pandemic has put another strain. This virus is in a whole different way cast a die on the kind of broken systems that we have throughout the world, and shown the kind of fissures in these systems. So let me give you a couple examples. Is that there was kind of a major study that's getting a lot of news up here about the fact that communities that have higher exposures to air pollution, in particular 2.5 particulate matter, have a higher rate of bad outcomes and particular mortality if they're infected with this virus. So communities that already were inhaling a high level of pollutants and air pollution are predisposed to have bad outcomes and death from COVID-19 infections. And I'm thinking a lot about what hurricane season is not that far away, particularly in the global south. How does one try to respond to the pandemic while also being in the midst of a natural disaster, whether it's a hurricane or drought or flooding? I can't quite wrap my mind around how we are going to try to face that challenge. And then food security. So the World Food Program just put out a major report that said the number of people facing starvation is estimated to double, from the current 135 million people to 265 million people. And sometimes when we talk about these numbers, we can just, it becomes abstract. And I kind of want to just really, take a hard look at those numbers and try to wrap our mind around the sheer quantity of people who are impacted in such profound ways. But here's the thing, is that I believe there are solutions everywhere. I actually am so sure that there are paths forward, and that through human ingenuity and creativity and determination, we are in a place in which we have solutions at hand, and we need just the willpower and determination and the imagination to move forward. If you don't believe me, this is a book I like a lot. It's called Drawdown. Take a look at it. It's 100 solutions to our climate crisis. So what should we do as healthcare professionals and trainees and doctors to be? So there's a lot of talk, of course, about reducing our own carbon footprint, but I like to move away from that argument. Of course, I'm trying to eat much less meat and use public transportation, really be thoughtful about the ways in which I am contributing to the problem. But I'm a strong advocate that we need systemic change and that we can't be focused on individual level. So this was a piece in the New York Times that I think said it succinctly, is to ditch the shame of the fact that we are all a part of a system in which, I'm in a room right now that's emitting greenhouse gases from electricity and heat, but we got to focus on systems and ourselves, join an effective group, identify what your role is, what strength you bring to this work, and also just, identify what you're fighting for and not just what you're against. The US healthcare system makes up 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. If the US healthcare system was its own country, it'd be the 13th largest emitter in the world. This is Marjorie Decker is my state rep. My wife and I have been doing a thing called community climate gatherings. We're not doing them right now, of course, but over the last year, we've been asking city councilors and state reps to come to our home. This is our basement. And we have people come over and we talk about food systems or energy systems, transportation, and then also talk about solutions and really kind of do it in a community building way. Organizations all over the place are buying into the issue of divestment. So I'm just going to say a quick word about divestment. This is a graph showing, just what the fossil fuel industries knew about the implications of burning fossil fuels. And you can see the emissions over time, and internal memos have now shown how much information they've known over time. I think has a lot of parallels to the tobacco industry. Harvard Medical School is having a very robust conversation right now about divesting. The university said that they're going to divest by 2050, but a lot of us think it should be happening sooner than that. The medical school faculty council voted 23-5 that we should be urgently divesting, which means eliminating support of fossil fuel industries in our endowment. You're doing this already. Another way to get involved is to learn and to take courses. So it's wonderful that Becca has been able to put this really great elective up, and there's other great options out there as well to continue your learning. And then to be a part of advocacy at a local level, state, federal, to provide testimony, to be talking to your reps. They really, particularly with students, they really want to hear from students and healthcare professionals, to be thinking about candidates that are addressing the climate crisis, and to be thinking about advocacy groups that are doing work that you believe in. So my sources of hope, I'm just going to take a few minutes and then we'll take some questions. Again, we got to look right at the eye of this crisis and challenge. But this time we're living in shows us that things can change very quickly. They can change in the wrong direction or the right direction. And we have to go a heck of a long way to get to where we need to be. And I would say the verb that defines how I feel most is just determination. It's we have to do this. And we're going to have to fight with all our being to create a sustainable future. So here are a few graphs. This is America's Pledge that shows a bunch of pathways that we can get to that IPCC decarbonizing our world. These three different colors is showing, basically if we do what we're doing right now, we can get decrease our emissions by 25% by 2030, but that takes, then we're going to need even more dramatic emission reductions over time. If we bottom up, means local governments getting really involved, so that's 37% decrease by 2030. And if we have a robust federal response, we could get to that mark that IPCC was noting, about halfway there by 2030. going to take a lot of work, but this America's Pledge was able to do studies showing pathways forward. Coal is an absolute free fall. That's been a success story, that coal is no longer economically viable and that a number of coal plants are being retired far sooner than anticipated. It's major implications in terms of a just transition and making sure coal workers have a sustainable financial future, and that needs to be addressed very aggressively. But it is true that coal is no longer economically viable, and it's very dirty and causes profound health implications. And you might be seeing in the news recently that oil prices are going negative, such that it's hard to get your head around the fact that it's less than free, oil prices, because of a lot of the systems, the glut of oil, and the fact that oil storage has been filled up. And so there are structural issues with oil and gas that they're facing long-term decline, but we need to accelerate that much faster. On the other side, transformative change is happening in renewables. This is a graph about global wind and solar installations. This is exponential growth, and it keeps growing and growing. I just saw another study showing that renewable energy is cheaper, excuse me, I'm forgetting the number, I think it was 2/3 or 3/4 of the world. I believe it was 2/3 of the world, and renewable energies is one of the cheapest sources of energy. This is, again, Yale and George Mason showing a study on different people's attitudes towards climate change. A lot of the times I get frustrated of climate denial and people who are not getting engaged in this enough. But there's a heck of a lot of people who are. A lot of people who are alarmed. These are changing dramatically over time, increasing in regards to how many people are alarmed or concerned, even cautious. So I look at the people in the middle here and try to advocate to them and to try to talk about the things that they care about. Often as a parent, I try to engage with them at that level. And these numbers are moving, and our work can move it further. And there's been a lot of transformational work at the state level. These are states that have enacted 100% clean energy mandates. This is already out of date. Rhode Island, Virginia have also committed in 2020. And so you can see how quickly this is changing at a state level to have 100% energy levels. International communities are doing great work. Europe has committed to decarbonizing by 2050. And the private sector is starting to get committed to this as well. And I think that's actually an important thing for changing the investments into renewable sources. Of course, my inspiration comes most from the youth. At the top right here is our medical students at Harvard. These are climate rallies from across the world. It's clear that our youth get this and are demanding a completely different way of doing this. But again, this bottom line is that we need to fundamentally rethink our future. We need to listen to science. We need to commit to public health systems. We need to center on equity implications, and we need a green recovery, a clean energy, sustainable growth into the future. We missed the chance to contain and limit COVID-19, and we can't do the same on climate change. And ultimately, I think this is an issue of our interconnectedness and our common humanity. I really think that climate change and planetary health is about us healing our relationships to the earth, to each other, and future generations. It is overwhelming, but I feel, again, a great deal of courage and determination. I'm seeing a lot of things change very quickly. We got to go a lot faster and a lot further. But I really believe in finding community and strength together, that healthcare professionals can play a very profound level in leading us to that future. All right, that's what I got. I went a little longer than I was hoping to, but thanks for having me, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Gaurab. Well, Sam is aggregating our questions here for you. I have one just to get you started.
Yeah.
That was excellent. Really appreciate your perspective and everything you brought to that talk. And for our students who are thinking about their practice of medicine, take us inside your exam room. How does everything you've learned about climate change affect your practice when you're right there
Yeah.
in the exam room with a patient? And how would you challenge students to consider these factors as they move forward into their practice in the future?
Yeah, I think that, this happens with my patients and my colleagues, I would say, when I'm in clinic I think, again, climate change and planetary health, once you see it, it's hard not to see it anymore, And so when I've got a patient who's got West Nile virus up here in Massachusetts, we got to be very precise with our language and clear, because climate change is a complex issue. So you can never say a patient got a disease because of climate change. But we know that patterns are changing, and that infectious diseases and increased rates of hospitalizations from things like heat and are going to increase. And so what I try to explain is that, oftentimes when people come in with seasonal allergies or asthma exacerbations, that are related to hotter days or during, extended pollen seasons, I do educate, and I think that we need to bring this into our vocabulary, just the way that we don't want people to be exposed to lead and things like that. We don't want people to be exposed to environmental hazards. And I think we need to continue to practice the way we speak about it, because it can feel like a big leap mentally to be talking about climate change in the clinic room. But we need to draw connections and be able to explain the complexity of it, but also explain the increased risks and how, increased likelihoods of disease processes that we're seeing as clinicians.
Thank you so much. Sam, I'll turn it over to you for questions that we have from the crew.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, for sharing the stories about how climate change impacted your patients, and also, I think you called it your personal climate change awakening. I really, really enjoyed that. So our first question is it's David from Mount Sinai. So he's saying, with economics playing a significant role in the decision-making process, how do you think governments and NGOs can institute policies to champion systemic change while also appealing to governments that may not see the obvious short-term gains by mitigating their footprint?
Yeah. So, listen, there's a really strong economic argument to invest in renewable energy. There's really no good argument against delaying, right? We have to decarbonize our world. We've dragged our feet for far too long, decades. And that's put us in the situation where we have to chase and rush, right? So the longer we wait, in Boston, we're in this building boom here now, and there's skyscrapers going up all over the place, and a lot of them don't have great building codes to be net zero buildings. So we're going to have to go back and retrofit these buildings, which is going to cost more money. And so I do think systemic policy can be done very effectively, intelligently, and say, hey, listen, there is an upfront cost to some of these things. Again, in a lot of places, renewable energy sources is cheaper than natural gas and things like that. But if there is an upfront cost, how can we use policy at a federal level, at a state level, to buffer some of that upfront investment and make it easier? Let's not forget that, a lot of ways fossil fuel energy is subsidized, right? So we're kind of allowing a lot of this dirty energy systems to perpetuate. And instead, we should try to make it easier for people to dive in, make it easier for the upfront costs of it, so that everyone will benefit. And again, thinking about the costs of hospitalizations that are related, the cost savings that we'll have from a health perspective, healthier people are not going to cost our society as much money.
Perfect. So we actually have a couple of questions talking about the same theme from Simona at University of Michigan, and also Steph here at Emory. They're both kind of wondering about, with zoonosis and the role that played in COVID-19 pandemic, are there things that we can do to help preserve biodiversity, help conserve those wild spaces, and kind of mitigate the transmission of some of those zoonotic diseases?
Yeah, so, this is a lot about land use, right? And so I think one of the major drivers is deforestation. And so we are just, there are a lot of reports, of course, in Brazil about this, but of course, the United States has had, I can't, there's some, maybe I can send this around later, but there's some graphs of just kind of reorganizing the world and showing how much of the world is dedicated to agricultural space. And it's just growing and growing, and we're cutting down our forests, and that really is one of the major drivers our decimating biodiversity. So I think we have to have an orientation towards protecting natural habitats. We got to be thoughtful about the way we grow and our cities grow, and how we kind of create density in certain ways so that we're not kind of sprawling and going into natural habitats. So we have to kind of, I think we have to wrap our minds around the idea that we are not going to do well as a human society if we kind of continue to have this unlimited growth kind of nature to our vision of the future, and that we have to have sustainable growth. We have to be living with within our planetary bounds. And for most of human history, you know, we were a small entity and the planet was very big. And we have, by this point, you know, post-industrial, we have changed our atmosphere. We have changed the equilibriums in a dramatic way, and we have to pull back from that. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. It looks like Sam might have gotten in there. So we'll give him a second, and
Okay.
if
I've been having that problem left and right, so I'm just glad mine
yes,
didn't freeze too much.
he's just very intense on your last answer. Are there any last words or things that you'd like to leave the students with, thoughts as
Well,
go? Oh, there you are, Sam. I was just asking Dr. Basu about any last words he has, but did you have any more questions before we go there?
Yeah, I did just have one question about, so we
Okay.
talked, you know, the impacts that climate change has had on zoonosis and the role it played in the kind of the genesis of COVID-19. But we've also seen some of the public health interventions and how they've changed carbon emissions, changed human behavior. And I just wonder if you see any opportunity, kind of a silver lining of maybe COVID-19, opening up the conversation about how we can kind of approach climate
yeah.
change differently.
Well, you know, one part is that, you know, the planet is resilient, right? And that when we stop kind of harming it, it's remarkable how quickly the air cleans up and the water cleans up, and animals can breathe again. And so I think it shows us the power of change and activity that we have, how quickly things can change. So of course, you know, the major story here with the pandemic is this, you know, the human toll and suffering. And so to be clear, this is not an answer to our challenges from planetary level, but it teaches me that things can change quickly. And I'm really amazed at how brilliant public policy can be, and these kind of public health, how smart people can be about how to move forward and to have creative design and things like that. It's got to be an organizing principle. You know, I think we have to say, hey, you know, we want our children to be safe and healthy, and there's a way to do it. And there might be some measure of sacrifice of the way we live. We can't understate that. But there's a real way that, you know, our best days are ahead of us. And maybe what I'll say, just kind of keeping an eye on time, is just kind of my closing, you know, message to you all is that, you know, I love being a doctor. You know, it's a real privilege, and right now taking care of people who are out of breath and scared. It's a profound honor to be taking care of people. And we have this really special opportunity. You know, we hear so many stories, so many kind of human raw stories of how people are struggling, and how, you know, a lot of the systems that we've created are just causing a lot of harm. And so I would ask you just to consider, just know your capacity, and that your place in society is one in which people listen a lot. And a lot of times the people in the decision-making rooms are not listening to the arguments that are really clear to us as doctors and healthcare professionals. So consider getting into the public forum and bringing your voice up. And it takes some practice, and it takes, you know, some public speaking and writing and all that stuff. And, you know, the center I work in, you know, we try to challenge people to kind of develop some skills in advocacy and all that. But I really believe that we can be very effective agents of social change, to reframe the arguments here, so that we can explain, you know, what we need for healthy societies, and to make sure people can live with dignity, and really kind of put the things in place to make sure our patients are doing okay.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great and empowering and optimistic last thought for us on this Friday evening. Everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Basu today with your claps, and I appreciate you joining us again so very much. Thanks so much, okay?
Thanks so much for having me, and wish you all the
Yeah.
best of luck and good luck in all your endeavors, and hang in there in this tough time, and wish you and your loved ones all the best.
You as well. Take care.
Bye.